So welcome to 4 lectures on Shakespeare. They aren't really 4 lectures, because on the 4th occasion, I'll be showing a film for you, Olivier's Henry V. We'll have a little preparation for that, a little preparatory talk, and then we'll show the film. Because it's such a perfect example of the way we experience theater. But I'll talk about that later. This course, This course is designed to answer, I suppose, a question that everybody asks, which is, I read that play and I didn't enjoy it much. What's wrong with me? No problem, no problem. I don't enjoy reading Shakespeare. Everybody else says Shakespeare is wonderful. I don't feel like Shakespeare is wonderful. What's wrong with me? And the answer is nothing's wrong with you. What's wrong is that Shakespeare was never intended to be read, ever. Shakespeare fought to keep his plays from being published. They made their money in the theater. A penny at the door to get into the theater, which gave you the right to stand through the whole performance. In the rain, in the sun, in the open air. Another penny if you wanted to go into the covered area and where the seats were. And another penny if you wanted a cushion for those hard benches. And 3 tuppence was a big price to pay for an afternoon at the theater. And theater was wildly popular. It was a little like the movies and television are today for us. But Shakespeare was so very popular in his own day that the publishers stole his plays whenever they could. How they got them, we don't know. Well, we do know a couple of them. We know how Hamlet saw it into print. They had shorthand, takers of shorthand in the audience who were making notes as fast as they could. And they got their scenes scrambled at one point in one edition, and they got the words wrong. They thought they heard one word and another came out. So we know that the publishers were dying to get this on. Elizabethans were very literate. Despite what you think of very literate people, they loved getting those plays and reading them at a penny or 2 pennies each play. But Shakespeare didn't like it, he didn't want it, he intended you to see the play in performance. So listening to me talk and trying to read the play are 2 experiences that are not going to be very rewarding by comparison. What you have to do is, when we talk the play, you have to see it in your mind's eye, on a stage in your mind. The Elizabethan audience pretty much had to do that too. I guess you know it was a bare stage, projecting out from a back wall in which there were 2 doors, a balcony, and a 3rd story where the orchestra sat and played. And there was a little bit of a closed area in the back that had a curtain that could be drawn, opened and closed, opened and closed. So there was a place where Juliet could be in her bed and die, and then they could pull the little curtain so that the corpse didn't have to lie there through the rest of the play. Right?
Come on in, Dorothy.
Come on in.
Come on in.
Come on in. If you want to.
You can't get in through the back. So.
You don't have to.
Yeah, I agree.
At any rate, you've got to see the play in your mind's eye being performed if you don't actually see the performance. See a performance. Furthermore, the language is something of a barrier these days because the language has changed. Slang in particular. Comedies have suffered more than other of Shakespeare's plays because the comedies have a lot of slang, a lot of puns that are no longer valid. They don't work in our language of the 21st century. And so you're going to have to draw a veil over that and just let the words wash over you. In fact, you're going to have to treat the words of Shakespeare like music. It's going to have to flow over you. And you're going to have to get the general effect. And it's going to have to lull you into a suspension of disbelief. You can't rely on the exact words. The other question I posed for you in the sign-up sheet was, is this the worst play ever written? I guess you know my answer is no, it isn't. Not by, well, Shakespeare wrote worse plays than this, a lot of himself. Take the early plays like Two Gentlemen of Verona and the late plays like The Winter's Tale and Timon of Athens, and you just, beyond belief, they're not worth reading. Yet Jackie says, and she's absolutely right. They're not, they won't repay your time. Most of them. Once in a while you get a decent performance of Comedy of Errors or something like that, which is kind of fun. But you still don't catch the language, and the puns are way off here someplace. The reason this play qualifies as being really bad is the plot. Shakespeare never had but one original plot. Of all the 30 what's-it plays that he wrote, that we're sure that he wrote, one is original. Do you know what it is? Midsummer Night's Dream. He invented that plot. It was made up of a pastiche of a lot of other plots that he borrowed from this playwright and that play and this playwright and that playwright and this novel. But this is a novel from Italy that was translated and sold by the booksellers in the street, and Shakespeare got a copy and he read it, and it did something to his imagination, and he could see it on the stage. Probably the finest modern translation of Romeo and Juliet is West Side Story. If you haven't seen West Side Story, if you have seen West Side Story, you've seen a very good modernization of Romeo and Juliet. And it has a lot to commend it. But the plot, per se, is unbelievably bad. And that's because it relies heavily on coincidence. Now, any writer learns, whether he takes a class or not, he learns somewhere. You don't write what is possible, because anything is possible. You write what is probable, because people can only believe what is probable. In other words, you're going to have this guy's going to be the murderer, and he's going to be revealed in scene 3, act 3. So early in act 1, you have to plant some clues, which when the audience looks back, they can say, oh shoot, I missed that. I knew it. And it makes sense to them. If out of the clear blue sky, the sweet little grandmother is the one who took the axe and dismembered the man of the house, you're just going to have a total blank from the audience and a very unhappy reaction. It's got to make sense. In other words, you've got to foreshadow in the writing, someplace early on, what's going to happen later. And in this novel, nothing makes any sense. The heroine is 13 years old. The hero's not much older, he's maybe 15. They don't specify his age. But he acts like a teenager. In one scene, he lies on the floor and drums his heels and holds his breath until he turns purple and cries and screams and hollers because life is so unfair and it's so adolescent. You know exactly. He hasn't got out. He hasn't passed 17. You know that. But the town of Verona in Shakespeare's day, in Romeo and Juliet's time, was nothing like the town. The town today has about 250,000 population. It's much smaller back then. So it wasn't quite as improbable, but the Montagues and the Capulets, the two families who hate each other's guts, they're the Hatfields and the McCoys of early Italy. And they fight whenever they meet. Even their servants fight the servants in their house. Whenever they keep meeting. In a fairly decent-sized little city, they keep running into each other and fighting. Very improbable. Romeo finds out that there's a party at the Capulet house, the house of his enemies. He's a Montague. Because the Capulets send out a messenger to issue the invitations to the party who can't read. And he walks up to one man, just a guy on the street, Romeo. And he says, would you mind reading these addresses so I know who to deliver these invitations to? Is that probable? No. And thus Romeo, who's trying to get rid of the lingering effects of an unhappy love, it came to nothing because the girl he chose decided to be a nun instead of getting married, which is a very popular thing to do in the Elizabethan era, theoretically, in tribute to the Virgin Queen, Queen Elizabeth. They didn't really, and they didn't want to be nuns, but they said they did. And so his girlfriend, Rosalind, says she's going to be a nun, and he has to forsake her. And he's trying to get over that. And so he takes the classic advice of Ovid to lovers: if you have an unhappy love affair, replace your love as soon as possible with a new love. So he decides to crash the Montagues' party. Logical, huh? And he does. Well, for a teenager, yeah, maybe for a teenager. And that incidentally is part of what masks and hides the improbabilities, that these kids are so young. And when they fall in love at first sight, and they fall deeply in love and decide immediately to get married, and do, and you say, oh, come on, wait a minute, hold back. But they leapfrog ahead. It's because they're so young, because they're adolescents, and that helps. It's unbelievable to us that 13 and 15 should have this kind of love affair, and the actors who play Romeo and Juliet are always much older than that. The joke in the theater is that if you're old enough to actually get the part of Juliet, you're too old to play it. The first Romeo and Juliet that I actually saw was Norma Shearer and Leslie Howard in a very extravagant MGM production in black and white. And she was, I suppose, in her late 30s.
Oh, that's really old.
You know, it's about the, you know, inch-thick makeup. Gosh, doesn't play 13 very well. The other thing that masks the improbable, oh, let me give you the biggest improbability of all. Juliet's father decides to betroth her to his friend, a young man called the Count of Paris, who has come to visit and is present at the party. And he announces this happily to Juliet, who is horrified because just that afternoon she went off and married Romeo. And does she say, okay, Dad, you're going to hate this, but I've got to tell you something? No. She makes protestation, says, I don't want to marry him. But he says, you marry him, or I'll know the reason why. I'll disinherit you. I'll throw you out in the street. And he storms and rages and scares her. So she doesn't say anything. So she runs off to the clergyman who married them, Friar Lawrence, who's rather a simpleton, simple soul, who loves his garden, and he loves his herbs and flowers. And he married them knowing it wasn't a wise thing to do, but and saying to them, well, I'll read you the exact speech, but love slow, move slowly. This impetuosity is very bad. And I'll read you the two speeches that are particularly involved with that because they're beautifully written. So she goes to him, and he can't think of anything better to do than to give her a drug which will keep her asleep in a death-like trance for exactly 42 hours. I'm surprised he didn't say 42 hours, 13 minutes, and 12 seconds, you know, because he knows exactly. And she will be in the family crypt. They're not going to bury her in the ground, they're going to put her in the crypt. And he will send a message to Romeo, who's been banished by this time, and is off in another town. And the messenger will get Romeo to come back and be there when she wakes up and get her and fetch her away. Except he sends a messenger who wanders fecklessly off and stays overnight in the first inn that he sees, and it's quarantined for the plague while he's there. So he never gets any further. Very likely, right? Very likely. This is the kind of coincidence There's no reason for this kind of... So Romeo's buddy gets to him first with the news that Juliet's dead. And he decides to kill himself at her grave. And he buys poison from an apothecary there and hastens back, and indeed he does, as you know. And of course, she doesn't wake up until he's dead on the ground. The timing is so suspect. It is so bad. It is so unbelievable. So how did this get to be such a beloved play? It is the language. The fact that everything happens so fast, the fact that the two main actors are adolescents, the fact that adolescents did marry in Shakespeare's day, and further, that they believed that the Italians were hot. Englishmen actually believed that the Italians were so hot-blooded that this was very likely. They believed that that the Romantic peoples were impetuous and fiery and would marry at 13 and would kill each other readily in the street. They believed that this was the way Italians behaved. And the fact that it happens so fast, as I say, that nobody has time to think. They act and then they think afterwards. And if that's the case, then they'll make some dumb decisions. And above all, the language. Shakespeare clothes this whole play in imagery of night and moonlight and stars and stardust. Every time the sun appears, it's a bad omen. Things are going badly. Reality is impinging on the romance. But lo, what light through yonder window breaks, it is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon. But he doesn't mean it. She is the sun. The lovers are their own light in the night. They're all this imagery that Shakespeare writes about. They're bringing their own light to the situation, to the moment. And just believe it. Listen to it. It starts right at the beginning. At the beginning, there is a chorus, that is to say a narrator, comes out and introduces the play. And this happens in a few Shakespeare plays. It was an old tradition, and it was dying by the time Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet. But there is a chorus in Henry V, you'll see it in the movie, and there is a chorus here who introduces the play. And he says, from ancient grudge break out new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. He meant hard luck lovers, ill-fated lovers. But that isn't what he said. He said star-crossed, and it has become such a wonderful phrase, we use it even today. The first scene is a fight between the Montagues and the Capulets. You start things off rousingly. You catch the audience attention right away with a battle royal on stage between the servants of the two houses and some peripheral friends. And old Capulet, there's some comedy in this play. There's some very funny little bits. For example, old Capulet is funny, Juliet's father. What noise is this, he says, trudging on stage with his wife. Give me my long sword, ho! And she says, a crutch? Why call you for a sword? My sword! She says, you're old, cut it out. And the Prince Aeschylus, the Prince of Verona, comes in and says, you've done this 3 times. If it happens again, I don't care which of you it is that breaks the peace, you're banished. Is that understood? Now, shake hands, go home, and knock it off. And who's left on stage when they gradually filter off? Romeo and his friends. And Romeo explains about his love for the fair Rosaline, who has decided to be a nun. In the middle of this comes one of the prettiest pieces of poetry And people just kind of ignore it. It's hard to understand if you read it, but listen and let it wash over you as though this were music. He's talking about love and the fight. Oh, brawling love, oh, loving hate, oh, anything of nothing first create. Oh, heavy lightness, serious vanity, misshapen chaos of well-seeming form, feather of lead, bright smoke, cold fire, sick health, still waking sleep. It is not what it is. And he's talking about love. And it's what's called an oxymoron. All you poets know what an oxymoron is. It's two things that don't fit, stuck together, like government intelligence. Feather of lead, bright smoke, cold fire, sick health. That's pretty stuff. And that's Shakespeare. He also gets in a few comic licks through sarcasm, which people don't detect. For instance, Romeo says, they say, Romeo, what's wrong with you? You're acting like a drip. And he says, in sadness, cousin, I do love a woman. And his cousin says, I aimed so near when I supposed you loved. I didn't think you loved a cat or a dog, you half-wit. I knew you love a woman. Oh, she is rich in beauty, only poor that when she dies, with beauty dies her store. She hath sworn that she will live chaste, she hath, and in that spring makes huge waste. Got to do something, get her out of my mind somehow. Old Capulet again. They walk off to one side, I suppose. They don't leave the stage because they're still on stage. And they appear to be talking over here. And Old Capulet, there are two doors in the back now through which they can go to various parts of the city. They're exits from the stage. And it is here in scene 2 that he talks about his daughter to the Count of Paris. My child is yet a stranger in the world, she hath not seen the change of 14 years. Let 2 more summers wither in their pride, ere we nor think her quite ripe to be a bride, let her be 16. And Paris says, oh, but younger than she, our happy mother's maid. Well, so he says, all right, tell you what, Paris, come to the party tonight. He says, at my poor house, look to behold this night earth-treading stars that make dark heavens bright. And that, again, night, stars, starlight, light. So, as I told you, the messenger who can't read hands Romeo, says, read this for me, and Romeo reads the guest list, and they decide to crash the party. And then we go to a room in Capulet's house. Now, if this were the movies, it would be easy to do, to slide back and forth between places. The only way Shakespeare can accomplish this is to have Juliet's room on the balcony, so that as these characters leave, she and her nurse step out on the balcony up above. And then as they depart, somebody else comes in below. They do it very cleverly. And the audience does what we used to do back in the days of radio drama. We would sit and listen to it. Do you remember sitting and listening to Lux Radio Theater?
Oh, yeah.
And you saw in your mind's eye all those scenes that Cecil B. DeMille was telling you. This is Cathay, and here's Marco Polo. Come to see the Princess of Cathay. And you could see it. And you could be knitting or doing embroidery or almost anything, but your mind's eye saw this. Well, that's exactly what they were doing in the theater with this bare stage, with a few chairs. They were seeing in their mind's eye, in this case, Juliet's bedroom. And we meet one of the comic characters, the nurse. The nurse can't shut up. That's one of her characteristics. She is Juliet's nurse and companion. And she can't keep her mouth shut. Lady Capulet is here to talk to Juliet. Nurse, come back again. I have remembered me. Thou hearest our counsel. Thou knows my daughter is of a pretty age. Oh, I could tell her age unto an hour. She's not 14. Well, I'll lay 14 of my teeth, and yet to my teen be it spoken, I have but 4. I only have 4 teeth. So if I bet 4 teeth, I'd lose them all, wouldn't I? And then she starts talking about her daughter who died. Susan. Susan is with God. She was too good for me. Well, as I said, let's see. Lamb is not, and she won't. She talks. And if you read this, you're thinking, what is this? But on stage, it's very funny because they're trying to get her to shut up. And she wonders, she just doesn't hear them, and she talks about her private life, and she talks about Juliet being 14. And she repeats herself over and over again. I remember, she says, she tells this anecdote. When Juliet was a little girl, I remember she tripped and she fell. And I said, does it hurt? And she said, yeah. She said, that's what she said. She said, and then, well, my husband was there too, and he could tell you. He picked her up when she fell, and he said to her, does it hurt? And she said, and she goes on and on and on and on. It takes up nearly a whole column of 1 page here, and if you're reading, you're going to be sound asleep by the time you finish this column. But remember how it looks on stage. Remember, you were not intended to read it, you were intended to see it. Another such scene is one of the most famous speeches, the Queen Mab speech. Those of you who know Romeo and Juliet know what I'm talking about. Romeo has a couple of cousins. Benvolio, who's a nice guy, and thus his name, Benvolio, goodwill. And Mercutio, who is an impetuous, hot-blooded youth, thus his name, Mercurial, Mercutio. And they're with Romeo, and they decide to crash the party with him. They're talking about it. And suddenly they take off. Mercutio takes off on this, I see Queen Mab hath been with you. She is the fairy's midwife. And he starts telling the story of Queen Mab, a legendary character. And again, this is something you'll read and read and read. These are the tricks she plays. She driveth o'er a soldier's neck, and then he dreams of cutting foreign throats, of beaches, ambuscados, Spanish blades, of healths 5 fathom deep, and then anon drums in his ear, at which he starts and wait. Huh? Well, believe it or not, this part in that terrible movie so long ago was played by Basil Rathbone. He was young then, very young. And he was the only actor in Hollywood, by the way, who had had formal fencing lessons. So he helped to train some of the actors. Well, that isn't quite true. Actually, Leslie Howard had some too, but they helped to train the other actors in the fencing scenes. But he's prancing around the stage, posturing and gesturing. What they're doing is, again, a classic tradition. You try to get the guy's mind off his love affair and onto something else. Ovid said that was one way to do it. So they try. However, we have one foreshadowing here. At the end of this scene, Benvolio says, come on, let's go. We're going to be too late. We're going to miss the dinner part. Supper is done. We shall come too late. Romeo says, I fear too early, for my mind misgives some consequence yet hanging in the stars. I feel cats walking on my grave, is the way we would say it. A premonition. They're big on premonitions in Elizabethan literature. I gotta tell you, watch how many times we run into that in Elizabethan literature. When we get to the party, these clear away, and I suppose the curtain in back opens and there's a festive table set up there. And the servants bring it forward. And the other guests come in. And there's dancing. And there's music. And there's a neat little scene with Capulet and one of his guests. Again, emphasizing how old, surprising how old Juliet's parents are played here. They're played at least in their 60s. They begin to dodder. As his friend says, let's go join the party, and Capulet says, you and I are past our dancing years. How long is it now since last yourself and I were in a mask? And the cousin says, oh, by Our Lady, 30 years? Oh man, it's not so much, not so much. You see, since the nuptials of Lucentio, come Pentecost, some 5 and 20 years. It isn't 30, it's only 25 since we masked. No, 'tis more, 'tis more. His son is elder, sir. His son is 30. Would you tell me that? His son was but a ward 2 years ago. Listen, 30, I remember him when he was a kid like this, and it was just yesterday. And they wander off, and Romeo and his friends come in. And Romeo looks across. It's very much like the moment in West Side Story when Tony and Maria see each other. Do you remember that? Across the dance floor, the dancing is going fast and furious, and they see each other. And suddenly, the dancers kind of disappear. And they're just the two of them in the spot. Oh, what Shakespeare wouldn't have given for 2 spotlights. 2 spotlights to pick, but the actors have to do it themselves. They see each other. He sees her, and he says, what lady's that which doth enrich the hand of yonder knight? And the servant says, I know not, sir. Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright. It seems she hangs upon the cheek of night like a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear. Beauty too rich for use, for earth too dear. Did my heart love till now forswear its sight, for I ne'er saw true beauty till this night. Wow! Unfortunately, a young cousin of the Capulets, Tybalt, who's very much like Mercutio, hot-blooded, impetuous, easy to anger, has heard him muttering over there and recognizes him. They're masked, but he recognizes the voice, and he says to his uncle, Capulet, Uncle, this is a Montague, our foe, a villain that has come hither in spite to scorn at our solemnity this night. And Capulet says, young Romeo, is it? He knew. He knew all along. And he's too good-willed, he's too kindly to do anything about it. 'Tis he, that villain Romeo. Content thee, gentle cause, let him alone. He bears him like a portly gentleman. I would not for the wealth of all this town here in my house do him discouragement. I'll not endure him. He shall be endured, goodman boy, I say he shall. Am I the master here or you? Go to, you'll not endure him. God shall mend my soul. You'll make a mutiny among my guests. You'll set cock-a-hoop. You'll be the man. And of course, Tybalt is somewhat taken back by his uncle's attack. Go to, you are a saucy boy. Actually, by attacking Tybalt in that way, and by repeatedly calling him a boy, he actually seals Romeo's and Tybalt's doom, because Tybalt is so angered, so infuriated. Ever tried to talk to an adolescent? Ever told them they're just a kid? And what do they, how do they respond well? No, they don't. And right then, Tybalt knows that if he ever catches that guy alone, he'll get him when his uncle isn't watching. So Romeo asks one of the, in fact, he grabs the nurse. I see. Oh, excuse me. I skipped over the big scene. The one. You remember West Side Story? Tony and Maria come together and they dance, and there is nobody else on the dance floor. There are a lot of ways of accomplishing this in this limited venue that Shakespeare has. He could, for example, have all the other dancers freeze, just stand absolutely still while these two remain in motion. He could have them turn their backs and continue to dance gently, quietly, with their backs turned so that their faces aren't showing. There are a lot of ways a director could accomplish this. But there are only these two on stage, and we have that famous scene, you know the one. If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, he says, taking her hand. The gentle climb is this, my lips, two blushing pilgrims ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss. And she says, good pilgrim. She's not doing a John Wayne. She's making a poetic reference here. You do wrong your hand too much, which mannerly devotion shows in this. For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm do holy palmers kiss. And eventually, he lands one right on her mouth. You remember the scene? And she says, he says, from my lips, by thine, my sin is purged, and he kisses her. Then have my lips the sin that they have, then have my lips the sin that they have took. And he says, sin from my lips? Oh, trespass, sweetly urged, give me my sin again. And she says, you kiss by the book. Now, if you said that to some guy today, he'd be very offended. But what apparently was meant was, you do it exactly right. This is a kid's way of responding. This is the way I always dreamed it would be. This is the way I read about it. And the nurse says, Madam, your mother craves a word with you. And Romeo says, what is her mother? And it's here that he finds out who she is. Her mother is lady of the house. Is she a Capulet? Be gone, says Benvolio, let's get out of here, let's get out of here. And Romeo says, I don't think I can. And Capulet says, gentlemen, prepare not to be gone, we have a trifling foolish banquet toward. In other words, he knows them, and he invites them to join him. He's being generous. So they go out to dinner. And Juliet turns to the nurse and says, go ask his name. If he be married, my grave is like to be my wedding bed. If he's already married, I'm going to die. And the nurse says, oh, I know who he is. His name is Romeo, and a Montague, the only son of your great enemy. My only love sprung from my only hate, too early seen and known too late. So, after the party, what happens? Well, the first thing that happens is that Romeo's friends are teasing him, and he doesn't like it, and he runs away from them. And he says he left the garden wall. So there's an empty stage, and Romeo comes in, and he says he left the garden wall, and now he's in the garden, hiding from his friends. because he doesn't want to stand up to their mockery. He jests at scars, but never felt a wound. They've never been in love. They don't know what it's like. Incidentally, that particular sentiment, like many in Shakespeare, is repeated in a number of Shakespeare plays. You'll hear the same sentiment in Othello. He bears the sentence well that nothing bears. It's easy for you to be brave. You aren't the one being sent to the hangman. And here, it's easy for you to laugh. You've never been in love. He jests at scars that never felt a wound. And then he hears a noise and he looks up, and of course, Juliet in her bedroom. Oh, that I were a glove upon that hand, that I might touch that cheek. And she's out there, oh, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? I suppose you know, because it's been publicized enough, that wherefore art thou, Romeo doesn't mean where are you, Romeo. It means why are you, Romeo? There again, the change of wording over the period of years has changed the meaning of the line, and the actor has to be able to carry wherefore art thou, Romeo, in a way that makes you understand that she's saying, why are you a member of the Montague family? Deny thy father, refuse thy name, or if thou wilt not, but be sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet. And you remember the scene. What's in a name, he says. That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. So Romeo would, were he not Romeo called, retain that dear perfection which he owes without that title. And he says, I'll believe you. You say the name isn't important? Call me but love, and I'll be new baptized, henceforth I never will be Romeo. And of course, climbs up. I can't imagine what they had for him to climb up on. There had to be some ladder steps built into one of the pillars that appeared to support, that were decorative pillars that appeared on either side of the balcony, that appeared to support the balcony. Because there's no way he could be dignified in shinning up a post. At any rate, he gets up there and he holds her hand, and they pledge their love to each other. And she says, and this is again, this is why the thing is believable. She says, I'm not happy about this. It happened too fast. She has one misgiving. I have no joy of this contract tonight. It is too rash, too unadvised, too sudden, too like the lightning which doth cease to be ere one can say it lightens. Nice, huh? But, gee, 3 paragraphs later she's saying, if thy bent of love be honorable, thy purpose marriage, send me word tomorrow, and all my fortunes at thy foot I'll lay, and follow thee, my lord, throughout the world. Well, she's young. Forgive her. Forgive her. And when Romeo goes to his confessor, Friar Lawrence, to tell him this wonderful thing that's happened to him, and to ask Friar Lawrence to marry them, Friar Lawrence is terrified. Holy Saint Francis, what a change is here, he says. Is Rosaline, that thou didst love so dear, so soon forsaken? Young men's love then lies, not truly in their hearts, but in their eyes. He said, but you didn't like my loving Rosalind for doting. Thou chidst me oft for loving Rosalind, for doting, not for loving, pupil mine. Thou bedst me bury love, not in a grave to lay one in, another one out to take. And Friar Lawrence's advice, wisely and slow, they stumble that run fast. trying to skip through here to get to something that Romeo with his friends is found by Juliet's nurse, who sets up for Juliet the arrangements for the two lovers to meet and to marry. And Romeo says that's fine with him, and he makes the arrangements. And when she gets back to report to Juliet, we have another of those funny scenes where Juliet can't get her to tell her the news. Have you ever had somebody do that to you? They come in, and they got something you want to hear, and they keep telling you, Lord, how my head aches. What a headache I have. It beats as if it would fall in 20 pieces. And my back on the other side. My back. Oh, my back. And I'm sorry thou art not well. Sweet nurse, tell me what says my love. This is after quite a bit of this. Your love says, like an honest gentleman, and a courteous, and a kind, and a handsome, and I warrant a virtuous. Where's your mother? Where's my mother? Well, she's within. Why should she be? How oddly thou repliest. Your love says, like an honest gentleman, where's your mother? Oh, henceforth do your message yourself. But Juliet finally gets her to say, you're going to meet in Friar Lawrence's house. He will marry you. It's all set up. Friar Lawrence, on the other hand, back to Friar Lawrence's cell, and again, I imagine that was the inner, what they call the inner below, that recessed area with the curtain. And I imagine that Romeo and Friar Lawrence were back in there. And Friar Lawrence is cautioning him, and once more, and this is the passage I told you I would refer to, about going slow. These violent delights have violent ends, and in their triumph die like fire and powder, which as they kiss consume. Love moderately, long love doth so. The swift arrives as tardy as too slow. But of course they pay no attention. And the first thing that happens, but before that there is the disastrous meeting of Tybalt, Romeo, and Mercutio. Mercutio, Benvolio, and Benvolio, two of Romeo's cousins, are in the street. And as Benvolio says, let's get inside. For now, in these hot days, is the mad blood stirring. It's a long, hot summer, and everybody's itchy for a fight. Let's get inside. But Mercutio stands his ground. I don't want to go inside. Says Benvolio, and I were so apt to quarrel as thou art, any man should buy the fee simple of my life for an hour and a quarter. Ugh. Waves him off. And then in comes Tybalt. He's looking for Romeo. But Mercutio gets in his way. Tybalt says, I want a word with one of you. Oh, a word with one of us? Couple that with something, make it a word and a blow. Well, Tybalt says, here's my guy. Forget about you. I'll be hanged if he wear your livery. Your man indeed. But Tybalt will not be put aside. Romeo, the hate I bear thee can afford no better term than this. Thou art a villain. And Romeo's not biting. Tybalt, the reason I have to love thee doth much excuse the appertaining rage to such a greeting. Villain I am none, therefore farewell. You don't know me. Boy! Notice that Tybalt calls Romeo boy. That's the word that got under Tybalt's skin when Capulet called him boy. Now he's turning it on Romeo. Thou shalt not excuse the injuries that thou hast done me, therefore turn and draw. And Romeo says, I'm not fighting with you. No. And he backs off. But it's too much for Mercutio. You're not going to fight with him after that? He says, Oh, calm, dishonorable, vile submission. How a staccato carries it away. Tybalt, you rat catcher, will you Now that's something that passes us over the head. Tybalt was a name that they gave, they gave a male cat, a Tib. And he is cat-like, Tybalt. He has the ferocity of a wild cat. And when Mercutio calls him a rat catcher, he's playing on his name, of course. And they do fight. He draws, and Tybalt draws, and Romeo, Benvolio, draw thy sword, beat down their weapons, gentlemen, for shame, and he tries to get between them. And what he apparently does is come over and hold his cousin, Mercutio, like this. And Tybalt, still charging, comes under his arm behind him and runs Mercutio through. And Mercutio is killed. Not quickly, by the way. It's one of those long, lingering death scenes that the Elizabethans were so fond of. He has time to say, a plague on both your houses, I am sped. A scratch, Mary, it is enough. Oh, where's my page? Go, villain, fetch a surgeon. Courage, man, the hurt cannot be so much. Tybalt has run away. They're trying to minister to Mercutio, who says, no, 'tis not so deep as a well, nor so wide as a church door, but is enough, 'twill serve. Ask for me tomorrow, and you shall find me a grave man. That's something that bothers modern audiences too, by the way, the tendency that Shakespeare has to make puns in serious situations like this. Here's Mercutio dying, and Shakespeare's going to wring a little laugh out of the audience. Ask for me tomorrow, and you will find me a grave man. I don't think he intended them to laugh at that, but just to appreciate the fact that this man can jest while he's dying. Why the devil came you between us? I was hit under your arm. And he dies. And then, and here's one of those coincidences that drive you nuts with this play, Tybalt comes back. Why does he come back? We will never know. But when he does, of course, Romeo pulls his sword, and they fight. He kills Tybalt, and then realizes what he's done. Now he's killed the cousin of Juliet. And in case you missed it, the prince comes in at that point, and in case you missed what was going on the stage at that point, Benvolio explains the whole thing again. Tybalt here slain, whom Romeo hand did slay. Romeo hath spoke him fair, bid him bethink how nice the quarrel was, and urged with all your high displeasure all this other problem. And that's partly because the audience was so inattentive in some ways in Shakespeare's day. They had people passing through the audience selling oranges. They didn't have water bottles, so they sold oranges, so you could wet your whistle while the play was going on and have a little snack. They estimated that it took about 3 hours to run through a play, and it was a long time to be standing there, and the audience would get restive. Geez, I was standing up for 3 hours. I could barely sit for 3 hours. But so once in a while they do this. They repeat what has just happened. We're coming close to the end. We will not be able to take you through the entire play and all the imagery of night and stars. But let me read you one more bit. While Juliet is waiting for the nurse to come back, the nurse comes. The nurse has come back. She's waiting for Romeo. Come night, come Romeo, come, thou day in night. Give me my Romeo, gentle knight, and when he shall die, see if you remember this passage and where it was used, most famously in our century. Give me my Romeo, she says, and when he shall die, take him and cut him out in little stars, and he will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night. Do you remember when that was used? The Democratic National Convention, immediately following Kennedy's assassination, Bobby Kennedy got up to give the tribute to John, his fallen brother, and that's the speech that he read. When he shall die, take him and cut him out in little stars. I still can't read it without tearing up. Of course, you know, Romeo's banished by the prince, but he and Juliet do marry anyway. And they spend the night together so that the marriage is consummated. And in the morning, we have more of that wonderful imagery about the night. It says, wilt thou be gone? It is not near day. It was the nightingale and not the lark. She says, don't hurry away. And he says, it was the lark, the herald of the morn, no nightingale. Look, love, what envious streaks do lace the severing clouds in yonder east. One of my favorite passages in all of Shakespeare. Night's candles are burnt out, and jocund day stands tiptoe on the misty mountaintop. I have to read. And so he scarpers down off the balcony and leaves. And almost immediately, old Capulet is in there talking to Juliet. I have good news for you. I've got you betrothed to the Count of Paris. He shall not make me a joyful bride. I wonder at this haste that I must wed ere he that should be husband comes to woo. I will not marry yet, and when I do, I swear it will be Romeo, whom you know I hate, rather than Paris. But he scares her, old Capulet. How, chop logic? What is this? Proud, and I thank you not, and yet not proud. Mistress minion, you thank me, no thankings, no proud me, no prouds, but fettle your fine joints against Thursday next to go with Paris to St. Peter's Church, or I will drag thee on a hurdle thither. You green sickness carrion, you baggage tallow face. I'll tell thee what, get thee to church or Thursday, or never after look me in the face. Speak not, reply not, do not answer me. My fingers itch. Wife, we scarce thought us blessed that God had lent us this only child, but now I see this one is one too much, and that we have a curse in having her. God spread, it makes me mad. Day, night, hour, tide, time, work, play, alone in company. My care hath been to have her matched. And now, having provided a gentleman of noble parentage, stuffed, as they say, with honorable parts, proportioned as one thoughts would wish a man, and then to have a wretched, puling fool to answer, I will not wed, I cannot love, I am too young, and you will not wed? Graze where you will, you shall not house with me. And you be mine, I'll give you to my friend, and you be not, hang, beg, starve in the streets. Do as thou wilt, I have done with her. Now, if you were 13 and used to living in your father's house and doing what you were told, that would scare you. And she is scared. And she goes to Friar Lawrence, and she gets this stupid potion, which will, as he says in the next act, Act 4, thou shalt continue 42 hours, and then awake as from a pleasant sleep. Sure. And I will send a friar with speed to Mantua with letters to thy lord. So I'm going to skip ahead just to the last. The last, of course, is a bloodbath. The first thing that happens is that Paris arrives at the grave to pay his respects to Juliet just before Romeo does. And Romeo sends his servant, says, stand over there and don't interfere. I'm going to break into the tomb, but don't you pay any attention. I just, I have a ring. I need, I promised to give it to this lady, and I'm going to put it on the finger of the corpse, so don't you pay any attention. And Balthazar, the servant, goes over there and falls asleep.
Yeah.
None of his business. But Paris and Romeo run headed against each other at the tomb. And notice how Romeo refers to himself. Paris says, you know, you're a Montague, and I'm going to take you on. You're the enemy of my of Juliet's family. Thou must die. And Romeo says, I must indeed, and therefore came I hither. Good, gentle youth, tempt not a desperate man. Interesting. Paris is a youth. I'm now grown. I'm now a man. And indeed he sees himself. By heaven, I love thee better than myself, for I come hither armed against myself. Stay not, be gone, live, and hereafter say a madman's mercy made thee run away. But of course Paris won't. They fight, and Romeo kills Paris. Oh, I am slain. If thou be merciful, open the tomb, lay me by Juliet. And he dies. And as just one more proof of what has happened to him in maturing, Romeo says, all right, I will. With faith, I will. Let me see who this is. Oh dear, this is the Count of Paris, who's supposed to be betrothed. My friend, told me Paris should have married Juliet. And he takes him inside and lays him inside the tomb next to Juliet, which is a very sweet thing to do and very unexpected. But of course, he drinks the poison, and it works, and he dies, and just at that moment, Juliet wakes up. And if you weren't like this, you wouldn't believe a word of it. But by that time, you should be so enchanted that you believe. And that's going to be the lesson of our believing, of our last meeting, the Henry V. How do you believe in the theater? It's called the suspension of disbelief. You go into the theater and you see the audience around you and you're fussing because the seat is not comfortable, or as Sally said, the chairs are all broken down. You're reading the program, the lights aren't bright enough for you to read the program well. You're aware of the bridge full of lights overhead. And think how it was in Shakespeare's day. Broad daylight, and people milling around and pressing against you, and the crowds must have smelled pretty bad because they were not fond of bathing Elizabethan era. And it just, everything going on. But as the play progresses, the enchantment grows a little at a time, until the audience disappears, and you are living in the movie, the play, the book, whatever has taken your consciousness, and that is where you're living. And in Henry V, you will see this happen on the screen. Olivier starts it with actors in gaudy makeup and paper crowns and cheap costumes, forgetting their lines and stumbling over each other. And as the British Army takes shape and takes ships and sails to France, it gradually becomes real. And when they alight in France, it is real. And the mud and the rain and the bleeding and the dying and the killing are real. And then at the end, the very end, when the lovers are united, they take hands and they walk with their backs to you, the audience, to look out over the countryside. And when they turn forward to take the applause begins and they turn forward to take their bows. They are the actors with the gaudy rouge and paper crown. And they've transformed again. And you will see played out before you not just a very fine British patriotic, goodness patriotic. Henry V was filmed during World War II. They had to suspend the filming of the battle scenes, these tremendous battle scenes out in the fields, because the Luftwaffe and the RAF were dogfighting overhead. And they would have to stop the cameras and quit filming. And it's remarkable they ever got it done at all. And it is, of course, a real patriotic hymn to British pluck. Not to mention the British longbow, which won the Battle of Agincourt. If it weren't for the longbow, they would never have taken back their little portion of France. But they did during the reign of Henry V. It was one of their few international triumphs of the period, and so they treasured it. And it was entirely fitting that it be done during World War II. But that's what we're going to look at on the last one. Now, next time we're going to do Macbeth, which is called the Scottish play by actors, because for reasons which are muddled and lost in the mists of time, actors have begun to believe that to say the name of the play aloud is terribly bad luck. Something really disastrous happens if you say, and so they call it the Scottish play. We're going to look at the Scottish play not as a ghost story, although it is. We're going to look at it as an example of Shakespeare's examination of the difference between reality and delusion. Illusion and delusion. That, as it says someplace in there, nothing is but what is not. The witches start it right out. When shall we three meet again in thunder, lightning, or in rain? And that shall be our set of sun when the battle's lost and won. What? Lost and won? Well, sure. Somebody loses and somebody wins. So everything is not quite what it seems to be, or is confusing. And you believe something, and it misleads you. Be careful what you believe. And this is Shakespeare's examination of it. It's really brilliant, even though people, as I say, regard it just as a ghost story. This is a good ghost story. And if I see you again next week, I'll be delighted.